Buen día a todas y todos. Les
Good day
damos la
to
bienvenida a la
everyone.
serie de webinars
Welcome to the webinar
Honduras en
series
encrucijada,
Honduras
un
at the
espacio de
Crossroads,
análisis riguroso
a space
sobre
for
uno de los
rigorous
momentos más
analysis
decisivos de la historia
regarding
política
one of the most
reciente
decisive
de
moments in
Honduras.
Honduras' recent
Contamos
political
con
history.
interpretación simultánea al inglés.
Simultaneous
Siéntanse libres de
interpretation
enviar sus
into English will be
preguntas tanto en
provided. Please
español
feel
como en
free to
inglés
send your questions in
para
either Spanish
participar
or English to
activamente de esta
actively
conversación.
participate in this conversation.
Hace apenas unos meses, millones
Just
de
a few
hondureños y
months ago,
hondureñas
millions of
acudieron a las
Hondurans
urnas.
went to the
Y,
polls.
sin embargo, lo que
And
debía de ser
yet,
una
what should
jornada
have been
de
a
certezas
day of
dejó más
certainty
preguntas que respuestas.
left more
Hoy estamos aquí
questions than
para
answers.
conversar al
Today, we are
respecto.
here to discuss
Esta
this.
es la primera sesión y
This
hemos
is the
elegido
first
empezar
session, and we
con lo
have chosen
más
to
fundamental.
begin with the
¿Qué
most
pasó
fundamental
realmente
question:
en las
what
elecciones de
really
noviembre de
happened in the
2023?
November 2025
Y tenemos
elections?
el privilegio de contar
We
hoy
are
con
privileged
Elvin
to have
Hernández,
Elvin
sociólogo,
Hernández,
analista político,
sociologist and
miembro del
political
equipo de
analyst, member
reflexión,
of the
investigación
Reflection,
y
Research
comunicación,
and
ERIC,
Communication
en
team, or
Honduras.
ERIC,
Elvin lleva años
with us today.
analizando los
Elvin has
procesos
spent years
políticos
analyzing
hondureños desde dentro,
Honduran
sus
political processes from
contradicciones,
within,
sus
their
actores
contradictions,
y
their
sus silencios.
actors, and their
Elvin,
silences.
muchas gracias por estar con
Elvin,
nosotros
thank you so much
y
for being with
permítame
us. And
empezar con una
let me begin
pregunta
with
que
a
puede sonar
question that
simple,
may sound
pero
simple,
creo que hay muy poca
but I
gente
think very
que
few
se ha
people
atrevido a
have
responder con
dared
claridad.
to answer
Cuando
clearly.
escuchamos que algo
When we
falló
hear that
en las
something went wrong
elecciones,
in the
¿de qué
elections,
estamos hablando
what
exactamente?
exactly are we talking
¿Es una
about?
narrativa
Is
política
it a
o hay
political
evidencia
narrative
concreta?
or is there concrete
Hola
evidence?
Hazel, un gusto saludarle y
Hello,
saludos también
Hazel.
a
Nice
todo el equipo de
to
Alianza
say
América.
hi to you and the rest
Gracias
of
por la
the
invitación.
Alianza
Ir a
Americas
Honduras
team. Thank you
siempre
for the
es centro de la
and
reflexión,
for always
siempre que
placing
hay
Honduras at the
tanto,
forefront of
tantas
the
noticias
reflection
diarias
where there are
a
so
nivel mundial.
many
Honduras
daily news at a
en las
global
elecciones
scale.
2025
Honduras
creo que
during the
va mucho más allá de
2025
la
elections
narrativa
goes
en
far
términos de
beyond the narrative
la,
with regards to what
la conclusión
happened.
más
The
inmediata que uno a la que
most
llega es
immediate or
que
quickest
estuvimos en un proceso electoral
conclusion that we reach is
esencialmente
that we
marcado
participated in
por
an
bajeza
electoral process
en el
marked
ejercicio de
with
la
low
gobernabilidad del
quality when it came
proceso
to the
electoral.
exercise of
Eh,
governance over
vimos
the
que no
electoral
en el primer
process.
tiempo, si
We
fuera
saw
como en un
that
partido de fútbol,
if you were
el
speaking in
primer tiempo
soccer
las elecciones
terms, the
internas,
first half were
primarias, fueron
the primary
maletas
or
electorales que eran a las 5 de la tarde
internal
y no llegaban a
elections
su
where
destino, para
the
poner
votes,
como
it was
extremos
5
la idea.
p.m. and they hadn't reached
Ese
the
ejercicio y el
voting
segundo
centers,
tiempo
facing
pues pasó
difficulties in
más o menos lo
exercising the
mismo, es
votes.
decir,
And during the
teníamos 20
second
días
half,
después y no
almost
teníamos
the
un
same thing
resultado,
happened.
no
20
teníamos
days had
una
passed and we
comunicación
hadn't
oficial del
obtained
Consejo Nacional
official
Electoral.
communication
Entonces,
with the official
eh,
results from the electoral
ese
committee.
día
So
alrededor de eso, de esa
around
precaria
surrounding
gobernabilidad,
all this
hay varios datos
precarious
que explican
governance,
esa
there are
precaria gobernabilidad
several
y
data that
explican o uno
explain why it
sostiene
was so weak and
en qué
explains
consistió,
why
digamos,
why one
el
maintains
bueno,
what
o al menos las
or at
evidencias o las
least
sospechas
the evidence or
evidentes
suspicions
de un fraude, es
that
decir,
that
de
a
una
fraud took
institucionalidad que fue
place, of
incapaz
an
de
institutionality that
tener
was not
control de todo
of
el proceso
maintaining
electoral. Es
control of
decir,
the electoral process. In
desde,
other words,
desde la movilidad, digamos,
from the
de las boletas
mobility
electorales,
of
de
the
la
electoral
recolección de esas
votes
boletas
and
electorales,
then collecting
desde la
those votes,
transmisión de los
as
datos,
well as
es
the
decir,
transmission
y
of
la
the data
publicación de esos
and
datos,
the publication
dejaron
of
mucho
said
que
data,
desear en general.
they
Aquí la gente
they were left
con
wanting.
facilidad está
And here
comparando
people
lo
are
que
easy
pasó en
making
Honduras y lo que pasó en
comparisons of what
Chile,
happened in Honduras with
poniendo el
what happened
ejemplo
in Chile,
de
using
países
the
donde el
example
proceso
of
electoral
countries where there
uno
was
es
an
el que está cerca,
electoral
más cercano
process,
todavía,
or even one a most more
por
recent
eso
example
habían
in Costa
elecciones
Rica, why
habían resultados
there were
en
there were
términos de
official
3 horas
results
después del
in
concluir las
pretty
elecciones.
much 3 hours
Y eso
after the
tiene que
voting
ver
process
necesariamente
finalized. And this has to
con
do, in
gobernabilidad
essence, with
electoral y tiene que ver
electoral
en esencia
governance,
con
and in essence, with
las decisiones que toma el
the
CNE y quiénes
decisions
toman las
taken by the
decisiones, qué papel
CNE,
juegan
and what
los
decisions are
comisionados
made, what the
y si esas
role is
decisiones
played, what role is played by
responden a la
these
voluntad de
commissioners,
los
and if those
consejeros o
decisions
la
are
voluntad de esos
have to do with
consejeros
the
responden a otros
willingness
factores, que me
of
parece
these
que vale la
commissioners,
pena
or if they respond
resolver en
to
esta
other
mesa.
interests, which is something else that we have to
Sí,
discuss.
definitivamente
Yes,
muchas de las
definitely. That's one of the things that we will be, one of the questions we will be discussing throughout this conversation, that for our audience and for all of us to follow this analysis with proper context, we have to talk about the framework in which these elections took place. How would you describe the Honduran electoral system? What were its strengths and weaknesses leading up to November
Bueno, es un proceso
2025?
electoral que
Well,
es
it's
muy
an
frágil.
electoral process that's very fragile,
No porque la ley
not
podría
because
ser
the
fuerte, digamos,
the law itself could
pero
be strong, so to
carece de, en
speak, but
perspectiva,
it
un
lacks,
elemento que
in
está
my
detrás.
perspective, an element that's behind that
Hablamos
supports
de
the
un
law.
sistema
We
electoral
talk about an
que,
electoral
que no
system
está
that is
liderado
not
por
led
los consejeros
by
del Consejo
these
Nacional Electoral.
commissioners, the commissioners of
Hablamos
the
de un
CNE,
sistema
the
que
National Electoral
esencialmente
Committee, a system that
responde a los
basically
propietarios de los
responds
partidos
to the
políticos.
owners of these
Y eso tiene
political
un mal de
parties.
origen,
And
es
this has
el
a terrible
nombramiento de los
origin
consejeros
when
electorales. Es decir, esos
these
nombramientos generalmente
commissioners
son
are named to
nombrados
the
y
committee,
se den en el Congreso
when they
Nacional
are
y
they
quienes
are
eligen,
appointed by the
quienes deciden
National
finalmente
Congress,
son
and
los
who
propietarios de los
finally
partidos
decides
políticos
are
de los
the
partidos
owners of the
grandes,
political parties, of the big
normalmente, que
political parties,
previamente se ponen de
National,
acuerdo
Liberal, and Libre, who at the end of the
ver
day
qué
reach an
personas
agreement
van
to see
a
what
poner en ese
person
cargo. Por
is
tanto,
going
esa
to
persona
be
no está
assigned to
allí
this role. So,
para
in other words, this
representar los
person is
intereses
not there
de
to
los 6
represent the
millones de
interests
votantes,
of the 6 million
sino
people who
para
are eligible
ajustar
to
los
vote.
intereses
Instead,
del
they are there
partido
to
político que
represent the
puso,
interests
y
of the
eso
political party that named them in
generalmente
that
la
role. And to a
ingobernabilidad
great
o la
extent,
confrontación
this
o la
lack of
incompetencia
governance or the
del Consejo Nacional
incompetence of
responde
the
a eso, en
CNE
gran medida
responds to
a
this
esa parte.
to a great extent to
Segundo,
the way they are named. Second of all,
este proceso electoral
this
estaba en
electoral
disputa
process
la continuidad
was
de
in
un gobierno
dispute
que
the
surgió de los movimientos
continuity of a
sociales
government that
o el
arose
retorno
from social
de
movements,
un
or it
grupo de
was the
políticos
return
que
of
habían
two
gobernado
political parties that had
por
governed the
décadas.
country for
Se habla
decades. They
hasta
say
de
that
un siglo, digamos. Es
that
decir,
they even say that they
el
have
conflicto
run the
político
country
más
for over
largo de
a
la historia
century. It was
de
always
América
the
Latina.
longest bipartisan
Y eso,
system of
digamos,
all of Latin America. And
hubo
this
esa ruptura en 2021
there was
y
this breakage
esos
or
dos
rupture
elementos de
in
poder estaban en
2021,
disputa.
and
Es
these
decir,
two elements
si
were
había
in
una
dispute,
continuidad o
if there
había
was
un
going to be
retorno
a
de esas fuerzas
continuity or
políticas
a
del poder.
return of
Y
these
tercero,
more
me parece
traditional
que
political parties.
hubo
And in
un
third place,
fenómeno
I
aquí
think
en
that
este
there was
proceso
a
electoral,
phenomenon
es
in this
que
electoral process, is that
hubo unos intereses
there were some
externos transnacionales
external
que fueron
transnational
determinantes,
interests which
es
were
decir, una fuerza externa
determinants in this electoral
que siempre
process,
sí
an
hubo, pero
external
nunca
force that
fue
was always
tan
present, but
descarada
it wasn't
y
so
tan intencionada
notorious and so
como lo
intentional
fue en este
as
proceso
it
electoral. Es
was
decir,
during
que
this electoral process.
el presidente de los
In
Estados
other
Unidos
words, that
emita
for the
72 horas
president of
antes
the United States,
unos tweets
72 hours prior
diciendo
to
por
the
quién
election,
votar y por quién sí,
post some
si
tweets
gana o
saying
gobierna tal,
who
va a
you should
tener
vote for, and saying
este
that
respaldo
if
financiero,
a determined
eso
candidate was
va a
going
ser
to win, they
va a
would
ser
receive
un
the support from the
elemento
U.S.
que
That's going
nosotros
to be
al
an
menos
element
no lo
that
hemos visto de esa
that
manera
we at
tan
least had not
descarada
seen
en un
in
proceso
such a
electoral
notorious
como lo
way
vimos
during
aquí. Y me
electoral
parece
process
que
the way we saw
esos
it in this one.
son parte
I
de las
think that
falencias, porque
these
¿qué es lo
are
que estamos
part of
viendo
the
cuando hablamos
reasons,
de
because
ingobernabilidad?
when we talk about lack of
La otra
governance on
palabra
the one
sería
hand,
pérdida
and
de
the other
soberanía.
word would be
Es decir, pérdida de
loss of
soberanía en términos de
sovereignty.
Estado y pérdida de
So when
soberanía
it
en términos de
comes less of
sociedad.
sovereignty
Es decir,
when it comes to
entendía la soberanía
society,
como la
the
capacidad que tenía un
sovereignty is the
pueblo de tomar
capacity that
decisiones
people have to take
sobre lo que
decisions
acontece en su
regarding
territorio.
what happens in their
Sin embargo,
territory.
en esas
Within this
elecciones
framework,
del 30 de noviembre
during these
se
elections
perdió en
of
gran
November
parte esa
30th,
soberanía
we
de poder
lost
decidir
large part
libremente
of that
sobre
sovereignty to
la
freely
elección
decide
de nuestras
regarding
autoridades
the
a nivel
elections of
presidencial,
our
fundamentalmente.
authorities, primarily at the executive branch. And what you just mentioned has to do with those that argument that the problem is not the system itself, it's that who operates the system. And this has to do, the system has to do with rules that might work, but with actors that could twist them to their convenience. And this leads us to the next point, and it's that we talk about these protagonists of the post-electoral scenario. You already mentioned that the CNE was within the eye of the storm, the political parties launched accusations against the other, accusations of fraud from different sectors. How do you interpret this map of actors? Who had which interest in which result?
Creo que hay
I think that
varios actores, digamos. Es decir, primero
there
los
are
actores inmediatos,
several actors. The most immediate
los integrantes del CNE
actors,
como
the members,
actores,
the commissioners were the
con dobles
primary
objetivos distintos,
actors with two
dos
different visions.
posicionadas, digamos, como en
Two
alianza con un solo
female
propósito,
commissioners who had an alliance with one single
comisionados desde
purpose,
una
and another
perspectiva.
commissioner from a
Tres
contrary
partidos
perspective.
políticos, dos
Three
partidos
political
en
parties,
alianza en sus decisiones y
two
un
working
partido
in
en
alliance
oposición.
with their decisions,
Sobre
and
eso
one in
es que había
opposition.
un
With what
proyecto
happened,
político
there was a
que
political
si
project
continuaba o
that
no continuaba.
they
Sobre eso,
continued,
entonces,
deciding if this political project
se
continued
fueron
or not.
configurando el resto de actores.
Based on this, the
Hay
different
actores
actors
como
were configuring
un
themselves
sector de
around
la
this.
élite financiera
There was
que jugó
a
a
sector
los
of
papeles
the
y no
economic elite
estuvieron
who
en el
played
escenario.
a significant
Hay otros
role,
actores que
and there were
jugaron
other
una
actors
parte
who
importante en el
played an
escenario y luego
important part
cambió
in
el
this
escenario. En el caso
entire
de
play, and
Honduras,
this play
jugaron un
changed.
papel importante
Now, they
hasta
played an
que
important
llegó un
role
actor externo, el
until
Comando Sur,
there was an
se
external
reunió a
actor, which
puerta
was
cerrada con
Southcom.
el CNE
They
en
met
el centro de
behind
logística
closed
del
doors in
CNE
the
con
logistical
el
center
director
of
de
the
las Fuerzas
CNE
Armadas,
with
con el señor
the
Roosevelt
general of
Hernández,
the
y a
armed
partir de ahí
forces,
ese actor
Mr.
que
Roosevelt
era
Hernández, and
que
this
fue
actor
significativo
who was very
en las
active
elecciones primarias y
in
hasta
the
cierta altura
primary
en el general,
elections and up to a certain
cambió
point
de
in
la
the
posición.
general elections. He
Y
changed
semanas
his
después
stance,
se notó la
and weeks
elección de las
later
nuevas fuerzas,
you
la
could
nueva Junta
see
de
this
Comandantes de las
with
Fuerzas
the
Armadas. Es decir, fue un
election of
actor
the new
que
armed force
estuvo
members.
ahí en el escenario.
And this was an
Luego
actor who was
tenemos
also
otro
present
actor
there.
importante que
Then
fue
there's another
el medio.
important actor,
Fue
which
determinante. Y
were
ahí
the
hubo un
media
posicionamiento,
outlets, and there was
la matriz
opposition from
mediática
one part.
centrando
In
en
other
ese
words,
sentido
the media
que
matrix
en
focused
Honduras
in
había
that
que
sense
decidir
that in Honduras
recuperar
they had to
Honduras o que
decide
Honduras
between
llegara
recovering
al
Honduras or
tema del
saving
comunismo
Honduras,
y
or
había que
they were
dejar
going
a
to
un lado
fall to
la democracia.
communism. So they had
Esa
to save Honduras
polarización
to
desde la matriz
democracy.
mediática
So
fue
this
muy fuerte
polarization from the
y esa polarización
media
se
matrix
fue
or media
a otro
outlets,
plano
and this led
a
to
través de otro
another
actor
plane or
y
another level, which
jugaron
was
un
the
papel
churches.
importante, es
The
decir,
churches played an important role,
hubieron
saying
movilizaciones
where there
en
were
agosto que en
manifestations like the
esencia
one in
era un
August,
acto
which
por la
were
paz,
in
pero
essence
fue
a
definidora
manifestation in favor
el
of
tema electoral,
peace,
es decir,
but a exciting role with the
especialmente
elections,
no para quién iba a ganar,
especially not for
sino por
with
quién
regards to
votó.
who was going to
Y
win,
eso
but
me parece
instead
a mí
who
que
not to vote for.
fue otro
So I
actor
think that this
muy
was
importante.
another
Y en
important
este
actor.
marco de actores
And
hay
within this
otro actor
framework of
interno que me
actors, there's
parece
another
que fue
internal actor
determinante,
which
que
I
tiene
feel
que
was
ver con
determining,
el
which has
crimen
to do
organizado.
with organized crime.
Jugó en, es decir,
That
financió a distintos niveles y eso me
it
parece
financed the elections
que
at different
estuvo presente.
levels. And
Y
I
en
think
ese
that this
marco
was
me parece
present.
que el
And
crimen
within this
organizado
framework, I think that organized
avanzó,
crime
dio un paso más en
took
una
expression
expresión
step
de
in
control
expressions
territorial
of territorial
que ayudó
control
a
that
condicionar por
helped
quién
to
votar y por quién
condition
no votar.
who
Es
to
decir,
vote for,
hubieron
who not to vote for.
comunicados,
There
hubieron,
were
hay
press
evidencia en
releases, and
cualquier otra
there's
ciudad
evidence in the
diciendo
different cities where they
por quién
said
se tenía
that
que votar y por quién
who you
no, y
should
si
vote
no, que
for
se
and
llevan
who
las
not to vote
consecuencias
for.
con
And
determinados
if you
gobiernos.
didn't pay
Y eso me
attention, you
parece que
would face
también
the
es un actor
consequences. And I think that
que
this is
cada vez
another actor
está
that
más en la
each time
mesa
is
de los procesos
more
electorales
present during
en
the
la disputa
electoral
del poder
processes
político.
and
Y
when it comes to
finalmente el actor
disputing the
externo.
political
El
power.
actor externo
Finally, there's the
fue,
external
como lo
actor.
decíamos
This
antes,
external actor, which,
en
as we
el caso
mentioned
del presidente
before,
Donald Trump,
in the
jugó
case
un
of
papel
Donald Trump,
determinante en
played
este
a
asunto.
determining role in this process.
Y quiero resaltar un
And I
dato que
want
tiene
to
que ver con
highlight
esto de
some
la
data has to
percepción
do with
en
this
la opinión pública, ¿no?
perception of public
En un
perception
estudio, en un
in
sondeo de ERIC,
a
se
survey
decía que
from Eric. It said that
84.8% de la población
84.8% of the
desconfía de los
population
partidos políticos,
distrusts the
número bastante
political
alto.
parties. That's a
Y,
very high
y el
number. And
83.4% desconfía
83.4%
del Congreso
did not trust
y
in
el
Congress. And
81.4% del Consejo Nacional
81.4%
Electoral.
distrust the
Es
National
decir,
Electoral
había,
Council.
o
In
lo
other
que usted
words,
describe es básicamente una
what you're
disputa entre
describing
actores
is
que no
there's a
confían los unos
struggle
en
or
los
fight
otros,
between
en
actors
lo
who
que
do not
la
trust one
institución
another,
árbitro,
where
donde tampoco se
the
confía
institution
plenamente,
who's the
¿no? Y en ese
arbitrator, and they don't
contexto,
trust them either.
como
So
ya
within
mencionó,
this
entró
context,
un actor externo, un
another
gran
external
peso.
actor
Y vamos a
entered,
hablar de eso
into the scene, and a very heavy actor. And we're going to talk about this. The U.S. made public pronunciations regarding the electoral process in Honduras. This is something new in the region. We mentioned this. But when it happened is very important. How do you interpret these interventions in public
Bueno, la
perception?
curiosidad es una de
I
las,
think that that is
la
one of, in
desconfianza
other words, the lack of
en
trust
de la
in
ciudadanía en los
from
actores políticos me parece
citizens
que ese es
in
un
the
problema.
political
Sí,
actors.
Honduras
I
es un país
think is
marcado por la desconfianza. Según
Honduras
nuestro
is
Servicio de
a
Opinión
country
Pública,
marked by lack of
la
trust,
desconfianza se
according
encuentra
our
en
public
Honduras, pero
opinion
donde hay
polls.
la
But
máxima
where
desconfianza
the greatest
en
part of
este campo
lack of
es
trust
justo
in
en los
this field
actores que
is
tienen que ver con los
precisely in
procesos
those actors
electorales,
that have to do with
como usted
political
lo da como
processes,
idea compartida de la
including
Conferencia
the
del
data
Consejo,
that
el
you
Consejo
mentioned
Nacional Electoral
from the National Electoral
o el
Council
Congreso
or
Nacional,
in the
como
Congress National
lugares
Congress
donde
itself as the place
se disputa
where
gran parte de la política
they
y
fight
del
over large
proceso
part of the political power
electoral.
and the
Pero
electoral
esto
process.
está asociado a otros
But this is
datos, y es
associated to
que
other data, which
es el
is
Congreso donde se
the
eligen las
National
autoridades.
Congress is where they elect
Son
these
diputados que eligen las
authorities.
autoridades
These
que
are
van a
congressmen and women
implementar las cosas
choosing
en
the
nuestra
National
nación.
Electoral
Pero
Council
también
members.
es,
But
es la instancia donde la gente
this is
percibe
the
mayor
agency or
corrupción.
organism where people
Es decir, cuando
perceive
uno
there's the greatest part of greater
uniendo
portion
variables,
of
estamos
corruption.
hablando que
If
es
you
donde la gente
join
percibe
all these
corrupción. Cuando
variables,
nosotros preguntamos,
when
¿dónde
we would
percibes
ask
mayor
people,
corrupción?
where do you think that
Es
there's
buena
more
parecer
corruption in
partidos
Honduras?
políticos
So
y
again, they
congresos.
mention
Me
political
parece
parties and the
que
National
es
Congress.
el
I
síntoma
think that
de un
this
problema
is a
mayor.
symptom
Y
of a
aquí sí quiero
larger
dejarlo en la
problem.
mesa,
And here
porque
I want to leave for
parte
discussion
de la
that
ingobernabilidad del
part of
proceso
the lack of governance in the and
y de estos resultados y de
and
este
of
fraude,
the
quiero dejar
results
como
and
dos
this
afirmaciones que me
fraud,
parece que son
I want
necesarias
to
en
leave
este
two
punto.
affirmations which I
Primero,
feel are
que
necessary
estamos
to
ante una
mention.
especie
First of all, that we are
de un
facing a
deterioro
type of
profundo de las
a
instituciones.
deep
Es
deterioration
decir,
of the
hay el
electoral
deterioro es que hay.
institutions.
Y
The
segundo,
deterioration
hay
is
una ley,
extreme.
pero
And
sí se
second of all,
reafirma la
there is a
necesidad de
law,
una
but
nueva
they
ley.
reaffirm the necessity
Y
of a
esto
new electoral law.
esencialmente ya
And
podemos
this
hablar qué
essentially
figuras
we
pueden
can
haber
talk
dentro de
about
esa
which
ley,
actors,
pero la
which
razón
figures
por
could
qué
be
lo
within
planteo
this
es
law.
que la
But the
actual ley
need for a new law is because the
está
current
diseñada
law is
para que
designed so
haya un
that
coordinador de un
for there
partido
to be
y
a
se convierte
coordinator
en
of a
ese
political
propietario de ese
party,
partido.
and
Es
this
decir,
allows
podríamos
these
resumir, la
coordinators to
actual
become
ley
somewhat of an
es
owner.
constructora de
The
caudillos.
these are the ones
El
that
caudillo que se convierte en
build
el
these
gran
groups,
definidor
and it
de los
becomes
procesos
the
electorales,
great definer
tanto
of
en las
these electoral
primarias para
processes,
ver
whether in the
si el
primary
caudillo,
elections to
si el propietario del
determine
partido
if the
avala
owner
a
of
X
the
corriente o X
party
corriente y prioriza
approves
esa
of a
corriente o
search
esa
of a
rama,
certain
ese papel
movement,
es
then
definidor.
that movement will
Pero es
definitely become
definidor
the
de las
winner.
elecciones
But
generales para ver cómo
it's
queda
also
configurada la
also plays a
votación.
role in the
Es decir,
electoral in the general elections to
lo
see
que busca
how
muchas
the
veces el
ballot
candidato
is
es
defined.
nunca
Many
cuestiona al coordinador
times
del
the
partido.
candidate never
Si lo
questions
cuestiona,
or gets into fights
si le
with the
dice, mira,
coordinator,
está
because if they
equivocado, mira,
question the
esto no pasa
coordinator or they
bien,
say, oh,
corren
you're
el riesgo
mistaken, things will
de
not turn
que
out
te
well,
quite de
they
la
run
parrilla
the
de estar
risk that
participando.
you are removed from
Pero
the
más
ballot that
aún,
you're participating
cuando
in.
ya está
But
electo,
even more so, once this
el
person
propietario
is
del partido
elected,
tiene
the owner of the
poder sobre la
party
bancada.
has a lot of party
Y
on
además,
the congressmen, on the
los
Congress
testimonios
members. And
abundan
the
de
test
diputados
there's
que han
coming
cuestionado
testimony from
al
congressmen and
presidente o al
women
propietario del
of when
partido
they've
y lo
questioned the
marginan del
owner,
partido.
and this person
Es
winds up
decir,
being marginalized simply
la
for
ley electoral
questioning
en ese sentido
the electoral law. In
hay,
that
hay un
sense,
problema de origen
there
en
is
ese
a
sentido. Es decir,
problem with its
necesitamos una
origin.
ley
In other
que
words,
ayude
we
a
need a
quitar
law that
esa visión
helps
más
to
vertical de los
take
partidos
away that
políticos y
vertical
avance a una
vision of the
gestión de la
political
política
parties
desde
and
una
moves
perspectiva más
towards
horizontal,
a
que
more
permita tomar
horizontal
decisiones
perspective that
más
allows
coordinadas
them to
que en
take
este momento
more
no lo estamos haciendo.
more
Pero
coordinated
termino.
or agreed
El
upon
poder
decisions.
del propietario del partido
The power of
se
the owner of the
extiende un
political
poco más
party
cuando van
goes
las elecciones al
beyond
electorado,
when they go to
porque ese
elections of a
partido
second
es
degree,
quien se
because
reúne
the
con la
owner of
bancada
the
o con los
party is the one
propietarios del
who
otro partido
meets
para
with the
definir
owners of the other
quiénes
parties
van a ser
to
los candidatos a la
define
Corte
who
Suprema de
will be
Justicia,
the candidates for the Supreme Court of
quiénes son
Justice, who are going
quiénes
to
van a
be
representar el Ministerio
who are
Público,
going to represent
quiénes
the
van a
public
estar
ministry,
en el
who's
Consejo
going
Nacional
to
Electoral,
be in
quiénes
the
van a
National
estar en la
Electoral
Procuraduría
Council,
General de la
who's going
República.
to be
Es decir,
in the Attorney
son
General's office. These are the way this law is made up, it gives a power to the owner of the political party, where I feel that's a large part of the problem exists, is precisely there. And this is why more and more voices demand electoral reform. Other voices say we just need an outright new law.
Justo era una de las preguntas que
That was
recibimos de la
precisely
audiencia
one
que
of the
está
questions that we
participando
received from
en
the
línea.
audience that's
¿Es
participating right
necesaria
now.
una reforma
Is a new
institucional
institutional
al
reform
CNE
truly
a
necessary
todo lo
for
que acabo
the
de decir, ¿no?
CNE and
Como
for
las
everything that
personas ya
you
están
just mentioned?
percibiendo
Since
que,
the
como
way people are
decíamos, no
perceiving that,
funciona
as
como
we
están
said,
las cosas ahora, entonces
things
requiere
do not work
entonces
the
un
way they are
reforma.
set up right now. So it
Y
requires a
volviendo al tema
reform.
de la intervención
And going
de
back to the
Estados
part
Unidos
about the
o a través de
intervention
los
from the
mensajes,
US via
hay
these
una
tweets or
pregunta que
messages,
está
there's a
relacionada y es,
question that's a related question.
¿por qué el pueblo hondureño es tan
Why
sensible a la
why are the
influencia extranjera
Honduran people
y qué
so
cambió
sensitive to
o va a
external
cambiar
influence,
en sus
or
condiciones de
what
vida
has
por haber
changed, or what
seguido
will
las preferencias
change in
de
their life
Donald Trump?
conditions by following the
Creo que hay
preferences of
varios
Donald Trump?
factores.
There are
Primeramente, un factor
several
histórico
factors.
que
First
no
is a historic
diligenciar
factor
primero en la
that
mesa.
which
Y es el
has
factor
to do that factor of
el made in hecho en Estados Unidos,
that
¿no? El hecho de
there's
Estados Unidos
the made
tiene que
in
ver.
the US,
Y
and
esa parte, digamos, del made in
that
hecho en
part
Estados Unidos
of being
está vinculado con
US is
la presencia de la
very
bananera
linked
en
with the
México.
presence of the banana
No
companies.
olvidemos
We
que en
cannot
todo el
forget
siglo
that
XX
during the
fue
entire
liderado esa
20th
presencia
century, it
por
was basically
las
led
empresas
by
bananeras.
the banana companies that were present
Esas
in the
bananeras no
US.
solamente
And these
tenían la
banana
capacidad de
companies
influir
had the
en las
capacity
decisiones
to
políticas del
influence
país,
in the
sino que
country's
tenían la
political
capacidad
decisions, but also the
de
capacity,
ellos conducían la estructura económica
they
del
led the
país,
economic
eran los jefes
structure
de
of the
gobierno básicamente,
country.
y desde ahí tuvieron
And
mucha
from that
capacidad de
point, they
moldear
had
la
a lot of
conciencia hondureña.
capacity to
Es decir,
mold
y
or
eso
shape
a
the
esta
Honduran
fecha todavía
conscious. So
hay sectores de la
even to
sociedad
this day,
que
there are
siguen
sectors of
añorando
society
las,
who still desire or
las
dream
empresas del
about
banano, es decir,
about these
cómo eran
banana companies
antes y
returning.
cómo son
They
ahora.
keep
Es decir, hay
wondering,
una
oh,
variable.
what was it like back
Segunda
then and
variable,
compared to now? That's the first variable.
nuestra
The second variable,
nuestra conexión a Estados Unidos
our
se
connection
da
with
en
the
todos los
US
sectores, desde la
takes
gente
place
más
in all
empobrecida hasta la
sectors,
gente más
either
rica.
with people who are
La gente más
more
rica,
impoverished and
todo
even
su
the rich
espacio
elite. For those who are
digamos, de
the case
compra,
of
de
the rich
conexión, de
elite,
descanso, de
for the
seguridad, están vinculados a Estados
all
Unidos. Cuando
security
uno
and
ve
rest is
la gente,
linked with the US.
digamos, con un poco más de
Sometimes
dinero, su
those who are
residencia,
a bit more
o sea, viven en
wealthy,
Honduras, pero
they live
realmente
in
su
Honduras,
residencia más
but
de
they're
permanencia la
more
tienen en Estados
they
Unidos.
have
Es decir,
greater or
hay
longer
muchos
term
de aquellos
residence in the US.
políticos y empresarios
Many
acá
politicians
hacen
and
que
businessmen
su
here,
esposa o su
they
familia
make
van a
their
hacer
wives or families,
ese
they
pasaporte y
to
eso
US
abre otras puertas. Es decir,
to have their children there so they can have a
y
US
eso
visa and
directamente conectado
passport.
también con el
And
sector
this is
comercial. Es
connected
decir,
obviously
lo
with
que
the
produce este
commercial
país
aspect, what this
por
country
parte, o
produces
sea,
in
de
large part,
plátanos
whether it's
o café
bananas or
o
coffee or
camarones,
shrimp
de aceites, de
or
azúcar.
oils
Esa
or
economía
sugar.
está conectada
That
a Estados
economy
Unidos,
is
pero
connected
sobre
with
todo
the
también
US,
de lo que importamos,
but
que viene
especially also with what
a
we
través de los
import
tratados de libre
through
comercio.
the
Y
free
por otro
trade
lado,
agreements. And
que
on the
es
other hand,
en este proceso electoral fue
that
el más
during this
relevante,
electoral
es
process,
la
which played a
dependencia del sector más
deciding
pobre
role,
del país a
is
través de las remesas.
the
Es decir,
more
estamos
poor sector
hablando
of the
de que en
country on its dependence on
2025
remittances.
recibimos
In
como país
2025,
más de
we as a country
de 10.300 millones de
received
dólares por
over
vía de remesas.
$10 billion in
Es decir,
remittances as a
más del
country.
25%,
Over
del 25% del Producto Interno Bruto son
25% of the
remesas.
GDP
Y eso
is
nos pone
represented
en
in
un poder
remittances.
que,
And this leaves us in the
que
hands of a power that
es un poder real, pero es
it's a
un
real
poder
power, but it's a power
no aprovechado por la sociedad
that
hondureña.
is not
No sé cómo decirlo.
leveraged
Es
by
un poder
Honduran
político
society. It's a
que no
political
se hace sentir,
power that
sino al
is
contrario,
not
muchas
felt or
veces es
perceived. It's
manipulado
the
también por
contrary.
este
It's
proceso electoral
manipulated as
para
it was
influir
during
en
this
su
electoral
voto.
process to
Hay datos
influence the
ahorita que
vote.
demuestran
There is data that
de los mensajes
shows
de
that
Donald Trump, pero cómo
from
esos
the
mensajes
messages
se
of Donald
convirtieron,
Trump, but
se
how these
reprodujeron por
messages
la matriz
were
mediática
reproduced by
de
the media
manera
outlets, by the
increíble. Es
mainstream
decir,
media
y eso
in
se
an
conectó con
incredible way.
otros
And this
mensajes
is connected with
que
other
llegaron a través de las redes
messages
de
that
WhatsApp
were sent via WhatsApp, which I feel would be another element to mention the aspect of technology linked to this intervention from the US. Technology that functioned to send tens of thousands of messages. There's data that say that there's 3.5 million messages within backing up the stance or position of Donald Trump's government, saying that you have to choose between communism or democracy, communism or freedom. Let's save Honduras. And these are messages that had an important impact during the election. So I think
esa influencia de Estados
that
Unidos aquí me parece
influence
que
from
en
the
esa parte,
US, I
por
think
ahora,
that
pues
within this framework
no
is
se resuelve
something that
fácilmente.
is not
Y en
solved
esta misma
easily.
posición de las remesas,
And within the
me
same
parece que un
connection,
sector
speaking about
importante de la gente
remittances, I think that an important
votó
segment of
por
the
el presidente
population
que eligió
voted
Donald
for
Trump en
the
su
president chosen by Donald Trump
en
with
sus redes
his
sociales.
tweets
eh,
and other
la gente
social media.
creyó
The
que al
people
votar por
thought
él
that when they would vote for
tenían la
this specific
posibilidad,
candidate, they
o
had
había
the
una posibilidad de que
possibility
no se
or there
pusieran
was an
TPS.
opportunity for TPS to
La
not
gente
be
tenía la
suspended.
posibilidad de que las
People
redadas de
felt that there was a
Honduras, al menos
possibility
para
that the
Honduras, podían
raids,
ser
at least
más
against
tolerantes.
Hondurans,
La gente tenía, o
would
sea,
be
eso
more
se vendió como
tolerable.
posibilidad.
That was sold.
La
That
mayoría mediática
was
vendió
this. That was
como
presented as a
posibilidad y al
possibility.
votar
The
por
mainstream media
este
said
sujeto
that
que
voting
señaló
for
Donald Trump,
the president
habían esas posibilidades.
appointed by
Cosas
Donald
que
Trump,
todos sabíamos que
this
eran
would become a
sumamente
possibility.
falsas.
Things that the
Pero
most majority of us knew was
el
completely false.
la fuerza, digamos,
The
de esa
force
voz
or
mediática,
strength of the
cómo esa
mainstream media
fuerza
with
histórica
that
y de influencia
historic
histórica de Estados Unidos
strength of influence
en
the
su situación
US
hondureña me parece
in
que ha sido
Honduran
muy
society, I felt played a determining role.
Gracias, Elvin. Y
Thank you,
esto,
Elvin.
hemos hablado
And
ya
we've spoken
de los actores, pero más allá de
about
los
the actors,
números y
but
estas
beyond the numbers
institucionales, hay una
and these
ciudadanía, ¿no? Que
institutional,
vivió
there
estas
is
elecciones.
citizenship
Y ya
that
nos dio algunos
experienced
elementos
these
de qué
elections, and
influyó
you gave us some
para
elements
que
about what
fueran o no a votar.
influence
¿Y qué
determining if people
esperan
would
las
or
personas
not
de
go out to
Honduras
vote, and what do
en el
people
cambio
from
de gobierno?
Honduras
¿Hay
await with
esperanza? ¿Hay
this change in government?
escepticismo?
Is there
¿O ambas
hope?
cosas
Is
al
there
mismo tiempo?
skepticism,
¿Cuál es la
or both things
lectura?
at the same time?
Yo creo
How do
que
you interpret
hay
it? I think that
una
there
visión,
is
digamos,
a
la sociedad sigue polarizada, ¿verdad?
the
Y eso yo
society
creo
is
que
still polarized or
hay un sector
divided.
importante de la
There's an
población de que
important
se da
sector of the
cuenta que fue engañado,
population that realizes that they were
de que
tricked,
le engañaron, ¿no? Es decir, sobre todo
that
cuando
especially when we
esto de que Honduras va a
mentioned
estar
that
bien, esto de que
when they say
Honduras, el
Honduras
tema
is going to be
de
fine,
los migrantes allá y las
or the issue with
redadas
migrants over there and
y
the
TPS,
raids
o sea, yo
and
creo que hay una
TPS, I
población
think
preocupada.
that there's
Pero
a
hay una población
population
que
that
también sí está siendo
feels
engañada
tricked, but there's another segment of the
bueno,
population
por lo
that
que está
feels it's
pasando en el
tricked
Congreso. Es decir,
because
todo
of
aquel
what's
que se
happening
quejó
in
de
Congress.
que el gobierno
That was
saliente,
said that the
que había
outgoing
corrupción, si habían
government,
abusos,
that
que el
if there was
camellón,
corruption
todas
and
esas cosas
abuse
que
and
se criticaron
nepotism, all the
en
things that
este
were
periodo que
criticized
estamos
in
justo
this
en un mes,
period, that this new
estamos,
government that's
estamos
fulfilling
cumpliendo
1 month, the same
en
things
los
are
30 días
happening
siguientes de haber
in
asumido el poder.
the
Y eso
30
me
days
parece
having
que
taken
hay un
taken
factor
office. So
importante.
in that
Entonces,
sense,
¿cómo miro la población
how
hondureña?
do
Me
I
parece que hay
view the Honduran
la
population?
inmensa
I think
mayoría,
that the
una
vast
inmensa, sino
majority, not the vast majority, but
aquella población
that
eh,
population
que,
that
que votó por el proyecto político que ganó,
that voted for the
me parece que
political
esa
project
población
that won, I
está
think that
como
this
un
population
sector de esa
is there's
población
a segment of
está
this
como a la espera
population is
de conseguir una
still
chamba
waiting
en esa línea y de
waiting to
esperar que el
obtain
gobierno
job or
actúe.
employment and hoping that the government
Y
does a good
escuchando
role,
sectores incluso de iglesias
a
diciendo,
good job.
bueno,
And I
ya no hace
hear
falta que
certain
esperen, porque
segments, certain
la gente
parts
que
of the
votó por
church is
este,
saying we
este
have to
proyecto
give them
político.
time for
El
those
otro
people
actor,
who voted
digamos,
for them.
que
The
votaron
other
por
actor, the
Libre
other
y
segment
demás,
who voted
yo
for
creo que
the
allí hay
outgoing
una
government, who
combinación
voted for Libre, there's a
por un lado, hay
combination.
una especie
On the one hand, there's a type of
erróneamente creo, de culpar a la gente,
mistakenly, I believe, of
desagradecida, que
blaming
en muchas
people, saying that
situaciones,
they were
creo que esa es una
ungrateful, that
errónea,
they
porque
never realized everything
la
that Xiomara
ciudadanía,
had done, and that's a
una parte
mistake
importante
because
fue, yo
a
creo que
very important
fue
part
eh,
of the population
chantajeada, pues fue
they
sobornada
were
para emitir
bribed
voto.
to. and they receive payment in order to vote for them. But there's another segment of the population that is very concerned, very worried, and especially those who are in the inner parts of the country, because what's perceived is that the current government, once they since they have low legitimacy and a dosage of legal questioning. What does this current government depend on? And I feel this is important, besides support from the media outlets, besides the support from the churches, besides the support from an important base of the National Party, and besides all of this and the governance tactics that traditional parties, they receive support from the economic elite. And this has to do a lot with extractionism, with mining companies, and with energy projects and the SEDES, the special development zones. In other words, on the second day of this new government, they sent to the international arbitration system to re-enter the system. And this will be a path, not because I don't think that they feel that Honduras will be sued, because if they're sued, instead it's a weapon of pressure, so that Honduras winds up accepting the CEDES. And Honduras will have the argument that they can't do anything but accept CEDES. And I think that this is a real concern, because what this generates is violence within these territories. It generates violence that exists there. And in this that the government depends on, there's the other force. There's the economic elite, and the other one that generates fear, which is the military forces. The changes that have taken place in the armed forces, who comprises these armed forces, this new makeup or new structure. These are members that in the outgoing government played an important role in exercising that power. And now they are once again they are an important role within the armed forces, because of the background or history that existed before, which was not to defend the interest of the population or the interest of the country. So I think that there's a real concern in that sense.
Sí, creo que
Yes, I
esto
think
elementos
that these
que
elements
fueron
that
muy
were
evidentes
very,
en
very
el año
evident
pasado, en
in
desarrollo
the
preelectoral,
last
en
year
todo lo que
prior to
significó
the
los cambios a
elections,
nivel
everything that had to
el
do with
ejército,
the
fue
changes
muy
within
alarmante
the
incluso
army,
fuera
they were very concerning,
de Honduras.
even
Y
outside of
creo que estamos en
Honduras.
un punto para
And I think
transicionar y hablar
point
del
to
tablero político.
transition and talk about the
¿Cómo
political
será la
landscape.
composición del Congreso
What will the
y qué
composition of the
nombramientos
Congress look like?
claves estarán
And
pendientes?
are there any key
Si tuviera que
appointments
decirle a
pending?
alguien,
If you had to tell
esto es lo que hay
someone
que vigilar en los
this is
próximos
what to
meses,
watch in the
¿qué le
coming
diría?
months, what would you tell
Bueno,
them?
yo creo que
I think that
digamos,
it
la configuración del Congreso es
the
determinante. Yo
current
creo que
composition of the Congress
aquí en
is
el EPE nuestras
very
reflexiones
crucial.
estamos insistiendo
In the
que
our
en nuestras
reflections, we're
palabras,
insisting that in
en
our
la reflexión de la
words,
radio,
in
que hay que
the
tener la mirilla en el
reflections that
Congreso
we
Nacional
have
por
on
las
radio, we
decisiones que
have
se
to
están
keep an
tomando
eye on Congress
alrededor
because of the
de
decisions that are
privatización
being
de servicios
made
públicos o
regarding the
alrededor
use,
de
the privatization of public
meter la
utilities,
lectura
or
obligatoria
or
o
forcing
el tema
schools to
de la
teach
SEDES,
Bible
por
during the
decirlo
school,
de
or
alguna
the
manera.
issue regarding the
Entonces necesitamos un
Sedes.
lugar en
The
esta mesa
National
para
Congress is
reflexionar.
a
Y
place to keep
esto
an
es
eye
así
on.
porque
And
el
this is
gobierno actual
because
se
the
parece
current
mucho
government
al gobierno que
looks
se
a
dio en golpe de
lot
Estado
like the government
anteriormente a Pepe
that
Lobo,
came about after the
porque
coup d'etat with
un
Pepe Lobo.
presidente
We had a
bueno
president
y
we
bonachón,
had a good, a
un
kind
presidente que
president, a
abraza, que
common
saluda, pero
that
atrás
hugs and
de ese
waves to people.
presidente
But
hay
behind the
unas figuras,
president, there are
hay unos
some
poderes que
figures
no
or
son
some
bonachones,
powers who
que
are
tienen
not
otros
that good,
intereses.
who have
Y
other
ese
interests in mind.
donde los tiene
And
muy
those
bien parados
interests
es
who
el
are
Congreso
where
Nacional.
those interests are more focused on is the
Por las
National
decisiones que hay
Congress,
que tomar
because of the
sobre
decisions they
concesiones,
have to
sobre
take
financiamiento y
regarding
sobre
concessions, environmental
proyectos
licenses,
económicos. Entonces,
and
me
economic
parece
projects.
ahí
So
que
I
sí hay
think
que
that
tener
this is where
la mirada, ¿verdad?
we have to keep
Y
our eyes on.
en esta misma línea de
And
preguntas,
within the same line of questioning, if we would have to ask us where another place to keep our
varios
perspective
puntos.
or eyes on, I would focus on several points.
Desde la perspectiva internacional,
From the
es,
international perspective,
es
I think
importante
it's
mantener la
important
mirada en la
to
institucionalidad
keep
del
our
gobierno.
eye on
Es
the
decir,
institutionality. In other
se llegó a
words,
hablar en diciembre, en
in
noviembre, de un
December,
colapso
November, and
institucional.
December, they
Es
talked about
decir,
an institutional
como que la
collapse.
experiencia de
In
golpe de
other words,
Estado
that the
2020
experience from the
volvió
coup
a
d'etat
ponerse sobre
in
el tapete.
2009 was
Este
being
país no tiene
discussed once
futuro,
again.
digamos,
This country
si no
does
se
not have a
recuperan las instituciones
future
públicas y
if they don't
especialmente las
recover
instituciones
the
públicas.
public
Me parece
institutions.
que hay que
I think
prestarle
that we
atención
have
en
to
este
pay
caso a
attention
Honduras
in this case,
por,
in the case of
por la
Honduras,
ubicación estratégica
for the
de Honduras en
strategic
Centroamérica, pues
location of the country
primera.
itself
Pero
within Central
las
America.
relaciones, estas
But
intervenciones que está haciendo
these
Estados Unidos
interventions
y la
being
presencia de
done
China en
by the
Honduras, me parece que hay
US
que
and
prestarle
the presence
atención.
of China
El
in
gobierno
Honduras, we
anterior
have to pay
dejó sobre
attention.
la mesa
The previous
toda la
government
discusión de un tratado de libre
left an
comercio.
entire
Eso
discussion of free
hacia dónde
trade
va a
with
ir,
China. So we have to think
me
about
parece
where
que
this is
hay que
headed.
prestar atención.
We have
Hay
to
que
pay
prestarle
attention to
atención
that. We
también a
have
lo
to
que
also pay
significa
attention on
a Juan Orlando Hernández como
on the
amenaza
future of
realmente hacia el poder
Juan
externo
Orlando Hernandez as a real
y
threat,
lo que ha representado Juan
and
Orlando Hernández
what Juan Orlando
para,
Hernandez has represented
sí, para Honduras
for
y los
Honduras
vínculos que
and
tiene. Me parece
the
que
links that he has. I think that that is a very
creo
crucial
que
aspect as
es
well.
importante
I think it's
seguir prestando
important
atención en la
to
configuración
continue paying
del
attention
Congreso y
to on the
también la
composition of the
configuración
Congress, but also
del
the
gabinete
composition of the
de Tito Fura. Es decir, hay
cabinet of
ejemplos, hay
Titos
datos
Fura. There's
de
data or
figuras, por ejemplo,
examples.
Procurador
For
General de la
example,
República,
the
que digamos
Attorney
es
General,
un
who
abogado muy reconocido porque
he's a very
ha sido
well-known
apoderado
lawyer
legal del
because
propio presidente, ha
he's
sido
been the
apoderado
attorney of the
legal incluso
president
Juan Orlando
himself.
Hernández,
He's also
o
been the
digamos
attorney for Juan
financieramente.
Orlando
Es decir,
Hernandez or certain
o
financial
abogado legal
conglomerates,
del propio
or
presidente del Poder
the
Judicial. Es decir, es una
he's
persona
also
que
been the
entiende
lawyer of the current
que está
Congress
vinculado
president. So
a
he's
los
somebody who's
funcionarios
been
y
linked to
es
these
el Procurador
very
General de la
important
República.
figures of the
Es
current
decir,
government.
cuando uno se pregunta qué
So
intereses va a
when you
defender,
ask yourself,
lo
what
mismo cuando
interests
uno va a ser
will
procurador.
he defend?
Procurador. Es
The
decir, una
same thing
figura
occurs with
que
the
estuvo
assistant to
ya
the attorney
desde
general. It's
luego
somebody
reconocido, pues,
who
porque
it's well
en
known
su
because
momento
back then
estuvo en el Consejo de la Judicatura,
he
una
was
figura
in
que tiene
the
poder
council
excepcional
of
en la
all the
Corte
Supreme
Suprema de
Court.
Justicia.
It was
Creo que
an institute created
allí
for the Supreme
cometió
Court of
abusos
Justice, but
que
there was a lot of
y
abuse
fue
that took
requerido
place,
por
and
o señalado por haber cometido 93 casos
he
de
was
malversación
signaled and
de poder.
accused of
Y es el que está de
malfeasance,
subprocurador.
and this
Entonces,
is the case of the
para
assistant
poner
to the attorney
datos
general. So
así
to
más sencillos, me parece que también hay que seguir la
to
pista
give more
a
specific
las Fuerzas
examples.
Armadas,
So
es
we
decir,
also
sobre
have to keep
todo
an eye on the
Fuerzas
armed
Armadas y la
forces,
relación que hay
especially the armed
con
forces and its
ciertos
relationship
funcionarios públicos y también con
with a
sectores
sector
del
of
crimen
the
organizado. Me parece a mí que
certain sectors
ahí
of
hay
organized crime.
vínculos
I think that there are
que
some
hay que
links
seguir
that
la
we
pista.
have to
Yo creo que también
keep
hay que
track
seguir
of.
la
I
pista
think that
al
we
tema de
have
la
to
amenaza
also
de
have
las
to keep an
instituciones
eye on the
de los
threats of
servicios públicos pues, del Estado.
on
Es decir,
the
hay una
threat of
amenaza
the
a
public
la
utility
privatización que en
institutions.
este
There's a
primer
serious threat
momento,
of
al menos
privatization. At
visiblemente,
this
hay
moment,
interés
visibly, there's
en la
interest
salud
in
y hay interés
health
en la
and
energía
interest
eléctrica, en la ENE. Yo creo
in the
que hay dos instancias
electric
que
grid.
son
These are
determinantes y hay que
two
prestarle la
organisms that are
atención
very crucial, and we have to pay
para este
attention.
periodo bueno, pues
Current government
serán 4 años,
it's
pero
4 years, but
uno, por lo que va escuchando,
from what we are hearing,
yo creo que no está pensado para 4 años, sino más bien
that is not
para largo plazo.
it's
Entonces,
not
me parece a
something
mí
just
que
for
ahí
this
hay que
specific
prestar
period, instead for the long term.
atención.
So we
Creo que
have
el
to pay
papel de las
attention.
iglesias
I
también
think
es
that the
muy
role of the
determinado,
churches is also
porque
going to be
hay
crucial.
sectores
We
de
have to pay
iglesias que están
attention because there
buscando
are sectors of the church who what they
no
want
solamente
is
el
not
hecho
only
de que se lea la Biblia,
for they
si
don't
hace
just want
conocido
people
o
to
se haga
read the Bible. That
digamos, laico, que si perdemos la
if we were
laicidad
going
del
to
Estado, que nos
become
peguemos
a
un Estado
state that is
laico,
no
es
longer
quitarle las barreras a que muchos
if it will no longer be a
pastores
secular country,
o
we
sectores de
would take
iglesia
away
están
barriers
interesados
or
en
obstacles
convertirse
from
en
churches
presidentes,
and pastors
en
who want to
diputados,
become
en
want to run
alcaldes,
for
que
president, want to
utilicen
become
la
congressmen
iglesia
and women. They want to become mayors
a estos casos.
and using
Eso
the
me
church
parece
in order to
también
reach these political positions. So this is why I feel it's important to pay attention to this. As I mentioned, it's several diverse points, but we have to keep an eye on all of them.
Sí, justo estaba
Yes, I
reflexionando,
was
son varios
reflecting
flancos
that
al que hay que
it's
ponerle
several
atención,
targets or objectives
pero
we have to pay
esto
attention to.
también nos damos
But
cuenta, ¿no? Que las
this is how
elecciones no
we
terminaron
realize that
ese día de la
the
votación.
elections don't
Las
end on
transiciones
that
también,
specific
y
day.
quizás
The
principalmente,
transition and
esta disputa
primarily
política que
this
continúa, y eso es
this
exactamente
ongoing
lo que
political
seguiremos
struggle.
explorando en
And
la
that's
próxima
exactly what
sesión
we will
de esta
continue
serie, que
exploring in
será el
the next
próximo viernes.
session of this series, which
Y
will be
hemos
next
recibido
Friday.
preguntas
And
de
we
quienes
received
nos acompañan en
questions
vivo,
from
y haré
those
lectura
joining
de
us
algunas de
live,
ellas y
and
me
I'll read some
disculpo
of
si no
them.
logramos
I'll
cubrir todas,
apologize if
porque son
we can't
bastantes. Hemos
cover
estado
them
muy
all due
efectivos,
to
muchas
time
gracias.
constraints. We've been had a
Le
very
pido
active
respuestas concretas,
conversation.
Elvin.
I asked
No,
for
yo sé que la
specific
concreción
answers,
a veces
Elvin.
nos cuesta
I
porque
know
hay
that
mucho que
being
decir.
concise can sometimes be
Vamos a
difficult when
dar
there's so
inicio.
much.
Hay un interés muy,
There's a lot of
muy amplio
interest,
en
a lot of
conocer
broad
a
interest in
Nasri
getting to
Ashura.
know Nasri
Nos
Afuda.
preguntan
They
cuáles
ask
serían las
us
capacidades y
what will be
vulnerabilidades
those
de esta
capacities and
persona, de esta figura que
weaknesses
ahora es el presidente
of
de
this
Honduras.
person who is now
Y
the
también
president of
tenemos una
Honduras.
pregunta
And there's also a question
relacionada a la
related
figura de,
with
más allá
the
de ser bonachón, como se
beyond being
menciona,
a
es
good,
una figura con
nice
muchos
person.
antecedentes y
It's
ya
a person who has a
recientes
lot
eventos
of
relacionados a la
history,
corrupción
several
cuando
elements,
fue
and
alcalde de
several
Tegucigalpa.
accusations
Aquí
of
Patricia
corruption when he
Montes
was the mayor.
pregunta, ¿qué
So
piensas
Patricia
sobre la
Montes asked,
declaratoria también de
what do you
emergencia
think of the
en el
state of
sector salud
emergency
que
in the
lo
health
presentó
sector
Patricia y es
that,
el camino a
in
la privatización? Un
Pati's
poco estos
opinion,
elementos
is
sobre
the
los que ha
path
tratado.
towards privatization of the public health
Ok,
sector?
gracias. Bueno, sí,
Thank
yo creo
you.
que
Yes, I
cuando uno
agree.
dice bonachón, no
When
por
you
ser la
say that
imagen que
he's
está
a nice
construida.
person, that's the
No,
image
no
that's
es
being
que,
constructed
es
around him.
decir,
It's
porque
not
lo que
that,
estamos hablando,
because what we're
estamos ante la
saying,
consolidación de un
we are
régimen
in the
autoritario
consolidation of an
con eso que ellos quieren,
authoritarian
pero que va a
government,
tener un rostro,
but at least
digamos,
it's
tierno,
a visible phase,
para
a
ocultar
very
todos
somebody
los
that
negocios que
likes
está en el Estado. Es
to
decir,
try to
no es una
consolidate
cosa
or
de la
attack
persona,
or
es una
tie up
estrategia de
all those
comunicación.
interests
Y
behind
eso me
the
parece
government.
lo que hay que
So
tener
I think that this is
ojo.
what we have to keep an eye on.
Bueno, es un presidente, digamos,
He's a president
una de sus
that
principales cartas que hay sobre la
his
mesa
main
es,
his
bueno,
his
es
main
exalcalde que
letters of
fue
person.
señalado
He
por
used
manejo
to
de fondos
be
de gobierno
the
municipal en
mayor
sociedades
of
particulares
Tegucigalpa,
privadas.
and he was accused of
Hubo denuncia,
handling
investigaciones
private or
de
public
haber
funds
usado
within his own
fondos
personal accounts,
de dudosa
and
procedencia
then
en
also
cuentas
the use
gubernamentales.
of
Salió
funds from his
en
name
un Panama
was
Papers
included in
famoso
the
que
Panama
apareció su
Papers
nombre como
using offshore accounts.
es también conocido
There's
por
also known
empresas
for
encargadas de manejo de desechos de la
companies
basura
who are
en San Pedro
uh,
Sula,
who handle waste management
un
in another
negocio
city, San Pedro
alrededor pues
Sula. He
de
also
estas empresas
has his business
o
ties
sea,
with all of these
con
companies
demandas contra las
and
municipalidades,
lawsuits
es decir,
against
un negocio
the mayor's offices.
aterrorizado, es una
So
persona
it's basically his all his
su
businesses are
fortuna está
tied to the
vinculado
state. So
con
his
el presupuesto del
fortune,
Estado.
all his personal wealth has to do
Y
because of the
ahí
businesses he's done
uno
with the
hay que seguir la
government.
pista que al ser
So you have
presidente,
to keep
las
track of this,
posibilidades, la
have
información
to keep track of
privilegiada
the
para
privileged
proteger sus
information
negocios
in
o
order to
aumentar sus
protect his
ganancias, pues
businesses
es
or
naturalmente que sea
earn,
así, ¿no?
increase
Y
his
eso
profits.
creo yo que
I think that this is something
hay
that
que
we
seguir
have to
la pista pues
keep
al
track
presidente. Es
of.
decir,
In other words,
qué cosas
what
ha tenido y
things
y por eso
has he
uno
had?
insiste
And
en
this is one
en la
insists
imagen
that
que se le está
in the
proyectando al
image
presidente.
that's being projected, and why is it
Esto pues
so
de
determining? It's
mediáticamente conectar con que maneja su
because
carro
in
o
the
con que si va a un
media
lugar lo va a esperar
they claim
alguien
that
o
he
por
always drives his
ejemplo
own car, that whenever he sees somebody he gets down and shakes his
Honduras,
people's hand.
un
In other
porcentaje importante de
words,
la población
a
tiene algún
large
tipo de
percentage of
religiosidad.
Honduras
Nuestros sondeos,
population is
el
a religious
78%
person.
de la población tiene
Approximately
algún tipo de religiosidad y
78%
de
of
ese
the Honduras
78,
population
cerca de la
believes in a
mitad
specific religion, and of this
tiene
78%,
preferencia por la Iglesia
the
Católica.
half of it
Bueno,
has goes to Catholic
en
churches.
la toma de
So
posición, la figura
during the inauguration of his presidency,
de sacerdotes y de pastores
there was a
hondureños
large presence of
o
priests and
el Día de
pastors
la Virgen de Suyapa, por
having
ejemplo,
mass
como
there. And during the our
le
celebration
ponen a hacer
of
la lectura de la
the
Biblia, digamos,
Virgin
cerca
here,
de la
they
misa.
read from the large part.
Nunca
They put
ocurre
him
eso
to read the
y
Bible,
eso,
and this
por eso
never
es
happens. And
construir la
this is
imagen de un
why they are building this image of a specific man, a strategy. Why? In order to hide these things that we mentioned, his ties with corruption or his wealth growing thanks to his business with the government, but also to hide his lack of capacities. It's somebody that is not able to speak for over 5 minutes coherently. His capacity to, in his political campaigns, his best strategy was to not speak. He would just show up greeting people and not giving public speeches. So if there are if they don't have if he doesn't have that capacity, how will the country be run? How will they teach strategies? In essence, what one sees is that until now the most visible face is not the president at a national level. Instead, one of the quote unquote vice presidents, her name is Maria Antonieta Mejia. It's one of the most visible faces because in that sense his relationship with a journalist and with the press is limited in that sense. And another question, just to finalize this issue regarding his profile, has to do with can we describe Asfura as a populist, as a right-leaning populist? Well, I don't think he began that way, but he will end that way. I think that in the case of the people behind them, for example, they began rejecting all the benefits from the prior government when it came to energy bonds and free registration at school. It's all populist. At first, they rejected them, that they said that no, they would not accept them. And then they said they will continue using them. So I think that they will follow that line of a type of being populist. And more than being populist, an image that's more controlled by controlling the mainstream media, a strategy that's not even led by him because instead by who's behind them, and an image like that somebody that has close ties to the church. And behind all of this, we will see the armed forces, the force of the transnational companies, and the links with organized crime, the pact of governance between the two traditional parties. I think that this is has to do more than being populist. Thank you, Elvin. That's a typical Central American history. Moving on to some questions related to the institutions themselves. Xiomara asks, my question is, if we don't trust in the electoral institutions, how do we guarantee democracy? And another question has to do with the system. What are the historic reasons why there isn't the second period of or don't trust these electoral institutions, how do we guarantee a democracy? It's a challenge, definitely a challenge, because there is no democracy without institutions. There is no democracy with political parties. If we want democracy, we have to invest in them. This is why in the institution insisting on with a political culture that's focused on these very important figures, a culture where people don't care about politics. They don't, and this I feel is it leads to people delegating functions of these public affairs in others, and delegating with the different sectors of society because we need political parties, we need political institutions if we truly want democracy. regarding why there isn't a second round or runoff elections. Uh, the source of power for the bipartisan system is exactly there. System in the political system, you're going to see that the children and grandchildren of former President Ramon Villa Bermudez from the 1950s are still in power. And this is thanks to these laws, this mechanism of accumulating this power. Or we had our the Congress because either they were too old or they died, but they were there running over and over again, up to five, seven, even eight times. And this is because the law allows it. Or mayors that have been in power 24, 28 years being mayor. So, and it's because the law allows it. And the fact for there to be a second round or runoff elections, it requires a new electoral law that strengthens democracy and reduces authoritarianism. And I don't have to mention about this to El Salvador because El Salvador used to have runoff elections or separate elections. One was for mayors and congressmen and women, another one for president. So if they're so loved by the people, then why change that? I'll just leave that there because I feel it's a good example of why these types of laws are, or so far there is no interest from the political class to
Gracias, Elvin.
change
Es
it.
una gran
Thank you,
pregunta.
Elvin.
¿Por
That's a
qué? Porque
very big,
estas
important
reformas a
question.
beneficio
Why
de
they
quienes sumergen
seek
en el poder.
these
Vamos a
reforms
pensar cómo
at the
discutimos
expense
esa pregunta
of
en el futuro.
staying in power? We will
Quiero
discuss that in the
retomar
future. I want
uno de los
to
temas
retake
que más
one
han
of the
salido en esta
topics that has
conversación
been
y
most
es esa
mentioned
matriz mediática. ¿Se sabe
in
quién
the
es la dueña de la matriz
conversation, the
mediática de
mainstream
Honduras?
media.
Y
Do we
esta
know who
polarización
controls the mainstream media in
mediática es
Honduras?
consistente con las
And is
acciones de
this
Libre en el poder.
consistent with the
Y la
actions
pregunta
of
dice
Libre
en tres
in
palabras:
power?
la
And in
población
other words,
hondureña sintió
Honduran
que un
population
gobierno de
feel
izquierda
that
mejoró
a
sus condiciones de
left-leaning
vida.
government improved their life
Bueno, sobre
conditions?
la matriz mediática, yo creo
Well,
que es
regarding
un
the
poder real.
mainstream media, I think it's
Hay
a
un libro
real
de un
power.
periodista
There's a
hondureño
book where a Honduran
que
journalist
lo definió
that
bueno,
where
siempre
he
hay gente que
defined it.
menciona eso, como la cuarta
They always say
poder.
it's about Latin
Pero
America. It's
aquí
the
él
fourth
hizo
power,
como
but
desgranó un poco para ver los
they went into
quiénes
the
la
fine
integraban, ¿no?
details
Y
regarding
los
who
vínculos que
made
había
this and the
entre
links
los
between
propietarios de
the
diferentes medios de
owners of
comunicación
the media
con
outlets
funcionarios públicos
with
o con
public
empresarios.
officials
Y al
or
final se llegó a la
businessmen. And at the end
conclusión
of the day, they
que
reached
hubo una
that
transición
there was a
ya hace ya varias décadas
transition,
donde los medios
decades
de
past,
comunicación
where
se
the
convirtieron
media
en
outlets
instrumentos de la
became
gente más rica del país. Es decir, la
instruments
gente más
for
rica del
the
país es
economic
propietaria
elites.
de
In
esos
other
medios de
words,
comunicación. Es
the
decir, y
rich elite
eso,
are the
o
owners of
sea,
these media outlets.
un periódico,
I can
dos
mention
periódicos que se
a
reproducen por
few
propietarios que son
newspapers
un expresidente,
where
para
the
poner
owner
así
is
ya
an
con claridad,
expert.
¿no? Es decir,
To give a
o
specific
otros
example,
dos periódicos que se
or
publican en
two
circulación
other
internacional,
newspapers that are
su propietario
printed
es
with national
seguramente está
circulation.
Forbes, el
The
segundo
owner,
hombre más rico
according
del mundo.
to Forbes magazine, is the
Para saber
second richest man in
datos
Honduras.
de en
Just to
manos de
give
quiénes
two
están los
examples or
medios de
data
comunicación.
of who
Y cuando
controls these
hablamos
media
eso de
outlets.
matriz
And we talk
mediática,
about this,
hay
about the
eso,
mainstream
hay
media.
un
There
par de
is,
medios que son
there
los
are
más
part of media
poderosos,
outlets
¿no?
which are the
Y de
most
esos
powerful
medios,
ones. And
el medio
of
de
this
comunicación se
media,
convierte
the media
no
outlet
en ese
becomes
papel de
not
formar
in that
conciencia,
role
no
of
en
shaping
no en ese
conscience
papel de
or that
construcción de
role of
opinión para que la gente
building
tenga
public
información y
opinion
pueda
so that
decidir
people
libremente,
obtain information
sino
for them to
es
freely
un
decide. Instead,
canalizador del pensamiento y de
something
sus
that
opiniones.
channels
Es
the opinions and decisions of its owner.
es un medio para defender los intereses de sus
It's an
adversarios.
outlet to express
No
the
digo que
opinion
van
of
a
its
hablar de
owners.
la empresa o del
I'm not
político,
saying that
no,
they're not going to
pero
talk about the
la
company or its
manera como se
owners.
trata la noticia,
The way they
la
handle
manera
the
como se
news,
abordan los
the
temas,
way they address the
los temas que están
topics,
ausentes del
the
debate, es
topics
el
that they
interés de los
are
intereses. Y
putting
eso
out there have to
en
do
gran
with
parte tiene
those
que ver
interests, and in large part that has
con
to
la
do
matriz mediática en el
with
país.
the mainstream
Sobre
media in the
Libre,
country.
yo creo
With
que
regards to Libre, there was a lot of expectation with regards if they had improved, if they were going to improve the life conditions. So if you were to compare the Libre replaced, it was a good government. If you compare it to the preceding government, when you see the investment, it was a good government. If you assess it with regards to expectation and what was done, there's there's a huge gap between what was promised when somebody says that they will re, re means doing something completely in a new way. And there was a strategy which I feel was erroneous in saying that when in the conditions of a country with the resources we have and the political strength they have it, they don't have the capacity to actually do that. To and when they say refound, what exactly are you going to refound? Are you going to refound the state, the government, or everything else? So that basic clarity, it leads to consequences because they become vulnerable to that mainstream media that from day one that they took power, took office, there was a permanent campaign against the government that vote against Libre. Besides the fraud, that vote of being, when I say a vote against Libre, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that Libre did not suffer a fraud, and that accumulated discontent had to do with those 4 years of a permanent campaign against the Libre government. And now we're seeing the country from day one, from January 27, 2026, until now, February 27th, there's a daily campaign trying to whitewash the image of the government. It's those two realities that you can easily compare, contrast. So, in that sense, uh, evaluating or assessing Xiomara Castro's government regarding how much life improved, it it started to try to give too many public benefits, but it didn't have the resources to do public policies attempting to transform society. It didn't have the resources or time to do so. Its largest investment was trying to maintain things. For example, trying to contain it did the National Electric Company of Honduras, because now we have the doubt if some sectors are saying that they have to privatize the electric company and that it would cause great harm to them. And we could highlight other types of things that there are some accusations of corruption, but not at the large types of numbers or amounts that we had seen in prior governments. For example, Sede Sol, that is corruption. We have to mention it. But when it comes to how money was stolen or how many acts of corruption, which were tens of billions of lempiras, or the issue regarding the 90 something hospitals during the pandemic, that large number, that large amount of corruption, we didn't see a number similar to that with Xiomara. Its other investment that we could highlight is in infrastructure. It had on two types of infrastructure, highways and on sports fields, that it's there. And during the last year, it raised the infrastructure investment in hospitals. Some of them were finalized and others were left unfinished. Other types of infrastructure, such as airports here in San Pedro Sula, the infrastructure was a line in which she invested a lot of money in. We have reached the end of this conversation. I think that it has been included a lot of elements. And thank you, Elvin, because certainly given us new information for our analysis. And above all, we want to thank Eric and Radio Progreso for all their work. And thank you to for joining us. This conversation does not end here. We'll have another session in the series, and we're going to collect these questions we couldn't address, and we will mention them during the next meeting, March 6th, to talk about structural challenges of this new government. Elvin gave us some clues, and we will have this conversation with Joaquin Mejia, who is also part of ERIC, and we'll talk about the perspective of human rights. I just want to give you for his time, and for everybody who sent their questions. Thank you very much for your interest, and we'll see each other in the next session. See you next time. Thank you very much.